In this introductory lesson to the nervous system, we're going to have a look at neurons, both the different functional types of neurons and the different structural types of neurons. So before we can dive into the different types of neurons, it's important we understand what they're responsible for. So when we talk about the nervous system is made up of a collection of cells known as neurons. Neurons are nerve cells. And these nerve cells work together to form the nervous system. The functions of the nervous system can be grouped largely into two different categories, being voluntary or involuntary. And these voluntary actions are the things that we think about doing, and involuntary being the things that we're not thinking about. The second thing the nervous system is responsible for is receiving and processing information from our different sense organs. So think brightness of a particular screen maybe, that's detected by your eyes, that sends a message to your brain, and then your brain is going to process that information. Okay? So again, the specialized cell in this system are our neurons, and they are designed particularly with one thing in mind, which is rapid communication. So compared to the endocrine system, in our previous topic, the endocrine system is much, much faster. So let's break down a neuron. This diagram on the left is only reflecting a portion of a neuron. What I will do is I'll just scroll down a little bit further. This is what a neuron looks like altogether. But what we're going to do now is we're going to break it down piece by piece so that we get a really good understanding of both the structure and the function of the common parts of the neuron. So to start off, dendrites. Dendrites are these short little extensions that are coming out of the cell body of the neuron itself, and their job is to receive messages or impulses from other neurons. Now, their job, after they've received that message, is to carry the impulse toward the cell body. And the cell body is what I'll highlight in green here. The cell body is all of this portion of the neuron towards the center surrounded by these dendrites. And its job, quite simply, is that it contains the nucleus, it contains all of the other organelles that are essential for proper cell functioning. Okay? And as a consequence, it connects those dendrites to our next structure, which we'll label on a future slide. But for now, we know that it contains, or that the cell body contains the nucleus, and as you would have learned in previous years of study, especially in year 11, the nucleus is like the brain of the cell. It contains all of that genetic information, and it helps control the function of the cell. So as we scroll on down, I'm just going to skip over this generic image here, and we're going to have a look at some of the other features. So what we've just labelled has been up here on our diagram. All right. So we started again with our dendrites, being these extensions from the cell body of the neuron, and what receive impulses and then carry them forward. And then we had our cell body where the nucleus and other organelles are contained. So we've labelled these three things so far. But what we mentioned with the cell body is that it connects dendrites to this thing known as the axon. So what I'm going to do in pink here is I'm going to highlight the axon. The axon is basically a very long extension of cytoplasm. Hopefully you can see this pink highlighter here that runs right through the middle, like so. Now, the job of this axon, okay, is again to carry messages, and it carries them away from the cell body towards something known as the axon terminals, okay? Now, this impulse itself can only travel in one direction, meaning that when the dendrite receives the message and it passes it to the cell body and the cell body passes it to the axon, it's traveling in one direction. It cannot go from the axon backwards, it's traveling one way. So as we've now just traveled through the axon, you're probably wondering, what are these other cells involved? Okay? And these other cells make up a thing known as the myelin sheath. Now, the myelin sheath is already represented in this blue on your diagram, so I'll highlight it in blue here just to make it a little bit more pronounced. The myelin sheath is an insulator, more or less, and it does two particular things, 1 and 2. The first thing is it protects the axon, okay? It's insulating, it's wrapping them up nice and cozily so that they are resistant to some knocks and blows. The second thing, and the most important thing for us, is that this myelin sheath speeds up how quickly these nerve impulses are travelling along that axon. The myelin sheath itself is made up of individual cells, and the individual cells of the myelin sheath are known as Schwann cells. So what I've highlighted in purple here is one Schwann cell. They are the cells which are responsible for the production of the myelin sheath, and very simply, they wrap around it. The final portion of this diagram that we have yet to label is the nodes of Ranvier. These are simply gaps, and they are gaps in between the myelin sheath, in between these Schwann cells, and something that we're going to introduce now, and it will make sense when we come back to it later on when we talk about action potentials and transmission along a nerve fibre, is that nodes of Ranvier are the location of depolarization. So the nodes of Ranvier, if I make my highlighter quite small here now, are these portions in between each of the Schwann cells. Okay. So here's another representation of a neuron. And when we're looking at this representation of a neuron, you can see really clearly the myelin sheath. So if I just get my yellow pen now, the myelin sheath wrapping around, many layers here, wrapping around this axon going through the middle, and each of these cells representing a Schwann cell. Together, many Schwann cells making up that myelin sheath. So some final names for us. Apologies, a little typo on my slides here. This should be neurolemma. The neurolemma is that outer layer of the myelin sheath, and it was labelled in our prior diagram. I'm just going to go back to yellow here. I'm running out of colours. But neurolemma is this stuff that is running down the outside of those Schwann cells. Its job is to help repair any damage sustained to those fibres. The very last thing that we're going to talk about is known as the axon terminal. And the axon terminal is where the axon ends. Now this diagram runs out a little bit before, so what we're going to do is we're just going to fill in this one here being the final little piece of Schwann cell, that continuing down there, and then eventually this cell is going to break out into some endings. And these endings are what we refer to as the axon terminals. These axon terminals are what are the final destination, are what carry that message to the next dendrite. Okay, so they carry that message to the effector, okay, so something like a muscle or a gland, or to the next set of dendrites. So that this process, one neuron, if we draw a bad one here, cell body, dendrites, axon running through, axon terminals, and then I'll draw my next neuron in blue. You'll see, again, cell body, dendrites. Now, that's a mistake on my part because these two never directly touch, and that's something that we will refer to a little bit later on when we look at synapses. So, some very quick definitions, just to make sure that we're clear on everything, now that we've labelled the components of a neuron. A neuron itself, as we mentioned right at the start, is a nerve cell. This is distinct from a nerve fibre, where a nerve fibre is usually what we would look at as being the axon, but it's basically that extension of the cytoplasm or the nerve cell body. Okay, so that's a nerve fibre. Best way of thinking of it is simply the axon. And lastly, what we've commonly thought of prior as nerves. A nerve is a collection of nerve fibres outside of the CNS. So outside of the brain and spinal cord, these are the nerves. So we're now going to look at 3 different types of functional neurons. So some slight differences with these next few neurons. The first division that we're going to look at is a afferent or sensory neuron. Its job is to carry a message from a receptor to the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is simply made up of the brain and the, what's going on here? Made up of the brain and the spinal cord. As such, it is located outside of the central nervous system, so it's located in the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves around your body that are not found in the brain or the spinal cord. So think your fingers, your toes, your nose, anywhere else. So some features, this will come back to when we talk about our structural neurons in a second, but they are usually unipolar neurons. Their cell body is located within the dorsal root ganglion, which is something that will come up in our future lesson looking at the spinal cord itself, and they often pass through that dorsal root as a consequence of this. So when we look at this image down the bottom, we can see that what this neuron is doing is it is taking the signal from a sense organ. So this one over here is a receptor, and this receptor travels along the axon, and the axon is made up of not just the axon itself, but these surrounding cells, which we can refer to as the myelin sheath. Towards the center of this neuron, what we see here is the cell body, and eventually we make it down towards the axon terminals. This means if we follow the thought process that we had when we were looking at the components of neurons earlier, that the transmission of the nerve impulse in this instance is going to travel from left to right. Left to right as we simply follow from the receptor through to the axon terminals. The second type of functional neuron that we're going to look at is an interneuron, sometimes known as a connector or relay neuron. Its job is to connect the sensory neuron that we just looked at to the one that we will look at after this, known as a motor neuron. These are found purely in the central nervous system, aka the brain and the spinal cord. Some things to note about interneurons is that they are generally the shortest of all neurons, and that is largely because they have very short axons. They're usually multi or bipolar, and they can be unmyelinated, so without a myelin sheath. The final type that we're going to look at is down here. It is the efferent or the motor neuron, and in efferent or motor neurons, they travel from those interneurons that we just looked at, and they travel to an effector. Now, an effector, as we mentioned earlier, can be either a muscle or it can be a gland. Now, as these are found outside of the central nervous system, they are going to be found in the peripheral nervous system. Generally speaking, they are always multipolar in structure. Their cell body is located in the grey matter of the spinal cord, and they're going to pass through the ventral root as opposed to the dorsal root. This effector that they target is going to be connected to those axon terminals, and we can see that where I'm highlighting in blue right now. So finally, we're going to look at some structural types of neurons. So when we're talking about the structural types of neurons, there are three main types. I've alluded to them throughout this lesson. So the first type, multipolar neurons, generally speaking, have one axon and multiple dendrites extending from the cell body. So in this instance, we can see that one cell body and then connecting out to our dendrites. Okay. Now, this is generally found in both interneurons and in motor neurons, but not so much in sensory neurons. When we look at bipolar neurons, the next type, they again have one axon, so similar to multipolar. However, they only have one dendrite. But these dendrites can have their own branches from there. Finally, we look at unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons, let me just make my highlighter a little bit larger here, have just one extension. Okay, so they're the really basic ones that we were looking at the beginning of the lesson, where they've just got one axon, and again, they are mostly going to be the sensory neurons.